It's bad enough that these claims are being made in our nation's courtrooms. They're also being made in our nation's classrooms. They want to indoctrinate children in how to think about their own bodies. So the genderbread person, this next slide here, was developed to help teach children how to think about their own identity. And you'll notice that it has 5 different spectrums. I'll read it to you. I know you can't quite read everything in the font with the lighting, but I'll read it. The first that it has up in the head, where like the brain is, it says identity. And then you look to the right-hand side, gender identity. They define this as, quote, how you in your head define your gender based on how much you align or don't align with what you understand to be the options for gender. And then the graphic lists 4 of infinite, that's a direct quote, 4 of infinite possibilities. Womanness, manness, two-spirit, and genderqueer. And you'll notice that they use arrows at the top there for how far along the spectrum of manness or womanness, two-spirit, or genderqueer do you identify. Gender is a spectrum. But your gender identity is different than your gender expression. So the next item on the right-hand side there is gender expression, which they define as the way you present gender through your actions, dress, and demeanor. This can be feminine or masculine, butch or femme, androgynous, or gender neutral. Those are the 6 options listed by the graphic. They also have biological sex, which they identify in the pelvic region. And then at the bottom of the graphic, they have both sexual attraction and romantic attraction. Now, none of these things have to line up with each other. So on these 5 different characteristics, you as a school student have to identify where you exist along various spectrums. What's my gender identity? What's my gender expression? What's my romantic attraction? What's my sexual attraction? What's my sex? And none of these characteristics need to necessarily line up. Each one is a freely floating something that you have to discern and determine. But the genderbread person got in trouble. The genderbread person got in trouble for 2 reasons. The first is that the genderbread person looks too much like a gingerbread man. And so it was accused of supporting the patriarchy. It was criticized literally for looking too much like a man. The second reason it was criticized is that it says in the middle of the screen, in the purple ink on the lower right-hand side, it says biological sex. And that is now a politically incorrect term that is outdated. So they created a new graphic to correct these 2 errors of the genderbread person. So now you have the gender unicorn. And it's appropriate that they chose a unicorn. A unicorn, of course, is a mythical creature. And this is what they're now using to teach children how to think about their own identity. And so you'll see that it no longer looks like a man or a woman. And then you'll see in the middle of the graphic, the new turn of art, sex assigned at birth. It's not biological sex. It's not a reality about who we are. It's now merely something that someone assigned to us at birth, which is surprising because I have friends who show ultrasound images with the sex assigned of their child at 20 weeks. So they might have to issue a new version of the gender unicorn so that it says sex assigned at ultrasound. But of course, they don't actually assign sex at 20 weeks. They can discern it. On a grainy ultrasound image, you can discern whether a human being is male or female. But what they want children to think is that their sex was merely assigned at birth. And therefore, if they're experiencing an identity conflict, modern medicine could reassign their sex. So one of the reasons why this matters is that all of us interpret our thoughts and our feelings and our experiences according to some background assumptions, according to some background beliefs, core convictions. And so the question is, will you, your children, your grandchildren, will they be interpreting their own thoughts and feelings and experiences according to the truth about human nature or according to the gender unicorn? If they go through a stage when they don't quite feel comfortable in their own body, will they respond to that with the logic of the gender unicorn, that puberty-blocking drugs and cross-sex hormones might be their best option. Now, why did the new graphic use the term sex assigned at birth? The people who created the graphic, the Trans Students Educational Resources, explain in the next slide. Biological sex is an ambiguous word that has no scale and no meaning, besides it is related to some sex characteristics. It is also harmful to trans people. Instead, we prefer sex assigned at birth, which provides a more accurate description of what biological sex may be trying to communicate. So that's the logic behind this. Biological sex has no scale and no meaning, but sex assigned at birth more accurately communicates what biological sex might be trying to communicate. All right, so from that general understanding of the human person, that gives rise to the four-part standard of care that the gender experts are proposing to treat gender dysphoria in children. So from a transgender worldview, gives rise to transgender medical treatments. So it's a four-part standard of care. And the first is what's known as social transition, where a child should be allowed to socially transition. This means a child as young as 3 or 4 years old, if they are consistent, persistent, and insistent that they are the opposite sex, they should be given a new name and a new pronoun and a new wardrobe and access to new bathrooms and locker rooms and sports teams. That's where that Dear Colleague letter from the Obama administration 2 years ago came from. It was to ensure that there would be ample opportunities for social transition in our nation's schools. The second step of the treatment protocol is that as that child approaches puberty, the child should be prevented from going through puberty in the, quote, wrong body. That if you're actually a girl trapped in a boy's body, going through puberty as a boy, according to the experts, would be very distressing. And so what's better to do is to place a child on puberty-blocking drugs to prevent them from developing. Needless to say, these drugs are not FDA approved for this purpose. They were approved by the FDA to treat a condition known as precocious puberty, which is the early onset of puberty. And they were tested and approved to be used temporarily to delay puberty back to the age-appropriate, biologically appropriate time. They're now being used off-label to indefinitely delay puberty, to block puberty entirely, which then leads to the third step of the treatment protocol, because now you have a 14, 15, 16-year-old child who's stuck. So you now have a teenager who's stuck in a child's body. All of their classmates have gone through puberty. They've hit their growth spurt. Their bones have lengthened and densened. Their muscles have development. But this individual hasn't. So the third step is the administration of cross-sex hormones to try to mimic puberty of the opposite sex, of the correct gender. So they will administer testosterone to teenage girls and estrogen to teenage boys. Starting around age 16 is what the current treatment protocol calls for, but there have been requests to lower that age to 14, that they're delaying puberty too long, and that these children should begin the hormonal part of their transition earlier. The final step is at age 18, they can undergo sex reassignment surgery. And so this can entail what's known as top and or bottom surgery. In the book, I go through all of the details. We won't go through them all tonight. In general, though, what this would entail, what it can entail, is the removal of secondary sex characteristics, external genitalia, in some cases internal reproductive organs, and then cosmetic surgery to try to create body parts that would resemble the opposite sex's secondary sex characteristics and genitalia. Why does this four-part stage start so early? And some of you looked shocked when I mentioned that this would be taking place for children as young as 3 or 4. Another doctor explained it to that same federal court in North Carolina. Peer-reviewed research demonstrates that prepubertal children asserting a different gender identity from the one they were assigned at birth are cognitively capable enough to be aware of the gender they are asserting. The meaning of a child's gender identity assertion at a younger age is no less valid than the meaning of a gender identity assertion of an older child. So in other words, that 3, 4, 5-year-old is cognitively capable to know what it means to be a boy and a girl, a man and a woman, and to know if they're trapped in the wrong body. And we're supposed to defer to the children. Children know a lot about themselves and their gender from a very early age. And whether they reveal themselves to be gender expansive, transgender, or eventually neither, the most important thing we can do is listen to what our children are telling us and really hear them. This is from a pamphlet from a group just known as PFLAG. That used to be an acronym that stood for Parents, Friends, and Families of Lesbians and Gays, but that left the T out. So one of the things that you will notice is that many of these LGBT activist groups didn't include transgender when they were initially founded. That many of these issues are so new that the groups that are advocating on their behalf didn't even advocate on these issues 10, 15, 20 years ago when they were founded. And so we're now considered on the wrong side of history and behind the times when even the activist groups are constantly playing catch up. This is a movement that's actually going faster than either the science or the research or the thinking has had time to evaluate. In that same booklet, if I remember correctly, there's another quote. This is from a professor at the University, the University of California at San Francisco. And she's the director of mental health at the Child and Adolescent Gender Center at the University of California, San Francisco Hospital. She explains, like left-handed people, our young transgender people are only a small minority of the general population. And like left-handed people, they are a variation of human development that is to be celebrated and honored rather than punished or denied, as if those are the only two options. And they are our best teachers in alerting us to the reality that gender exists primarily between our ears, in our brains and minds, and not necessarily by what is between our legs, our genitalia, or in our accompanying XX or XY chromosome, as many are mistakenly prone to believe. We demonstrate how much we have yet to learn when we say, but honey, you can't be a girl. You're a boy because you have a penis. Boys have penises and girls have vaginas. She continues. They refuse to pin themselves down as either male or female. Maybe they're a boy-girl, or a gender hybrid, or gender ambidextrous, moving freely between genders, living somewhere in between, or creating their own mosaic of gender identity and expression. As they grow older, they might identify themselves as agender, or gender neutral, or gender queer. Each one of these children is exercising their gender creativity, and we can think of them as our gender creative children. And yet, the activists are suggesting that we should radically change a child's body with puberty-blocking drugs, with cross-sex hormones, with surgery for 18-year-olds, even when in the very same breath, they admit that as they grow older, they might identify as something else. So they want to tell us on the one hand that this is biologically determined in the womb, it's immutable, it's unchangeable. And then on the other hand, they want to tell us that this is something that's fluid and exists along a spectrum. And they might identify as a boy-girl or gender hybrid or gender ambidextrous or moving freely between genders, living somewhere in between. And as they grow up, they might change. And yet now they want to direct pharmacological agents at their body to lock them into whatever they're currently identifying as and to prevent their normal biological development. Okay, so that this is still in the kind of how to understand what's going on stage. We looked at the worldview, how they think about the human person. We looked at the medicine. Now I want to say a little bit about the public policy. And I just want to focus on 4 issues. The first are, what will be the lessons that are taught about gender at your local public school? Even if you're fortunate enough to be able to opt out of the local public school system to send your kids to a private school or a religious school, what is the government teaching your neighbor's children? For those of you who are trapped in the nation's public school system, what is the government teaching your children? So one of the things that we have to be concerned about is how will activists use compulsory attendance at government-run public schools as a way of indoctrinating young people with the genderbread person or the gender unicorn? What will be taught when it comes to these issues? A second issue, how will access to sex-specific facilities be determined? Will it be determined by biology, where we have separate bathrooms and locker rooms and sports teams for boys and girls, for men and women, based on the biological differences between boys and girls and men and women? Or will it be determined by gender identity, where a student can determine which facility to use based upon how they subjectively identify? Then there are questions of what sort of speech will be mandated. In New York City, you can be fined up to $250,000 for intentionally misgendering someone. Jordan Peterson in Canada originally came to prominence by refusing to go along with one of these pronoun mandates in Toronto. And then fourth, there's the question of the provision of desired medical services. This is a lesser well-known part about Obamacare. But in the last year of the Obama administration, in May of 2016, on the very same day when the Department of Education and the Department of Justice issued that Dear Colleague letter that impacted all of the nation's schools, bathrooms, and locker rooms, and dorm rooms, and hotel rooms, and sports teams, the Department of Health and Human Services issued a new regulation under Obamacare saying that all healthcare plans regulated under Obamacare had to cover sex reassignment procedures, and all relevant physicians had to perform them. So this was like Hobby Lobby and the Little Sisters of the Poor on steroids. All of their healthcare plans would have to cover both hormonal and surgical transition procedures, and physicians, if they were otherwise qualified, would have to perform them. So if you're an endocrinologist that does testosterone therapy for men with low testosterone, you would have to do it for women who want to become men. If you're a surgeon who performs hysterectomies and mastectomies in the case of cancer, you would have to perform them on women who want to identify as men. This regulation from the Department of Health and Human Services had no exemptions for religious liberty, it had no protections for conscience, and it gave no consideration at all for the best medical judgment of the physician. Many physicians, regardless of their religious commitments, regardless of their moral commitments, they simply think reassignment procedures are bad medicine. They agree with Dr. McHugh that we shouldn't be directing the therapy at the body, but should be directing it at the mind. And they would be mandated under this, at pains of losing their medical license, being guilty of discrimination. Thankfully, the day before this mandate was to go into effect, a federal judge struck it down. And then 3 weeks later, we had a change of presidential administration, and the new administration did not contest that judge's ruling and has subsequently rescinded the regulation. On the school part, in the interest of time, I'm going to skip one slide and just go to the next slide because it gets to the bottom line here. Ultimately, the school environment must be set up so that transgender girls are treated like all other girls and transgender boys like all other boys. Now remember, what is a transgender girl? A boy who identifies as a girl. So they're saying here, ultimately the school has to be set up when it comes to bathrooms, locker rooms, dorm rooms for colleges, hotel rooms for overnight field trips, athletic participation. It has to be set up so that boys who identify as girls are treated like all other girls. That was in a handbook titled Schools in Transitions. Schools in Transition, a guide for supporting transgender students in K through 12 schools. So you realize K through 12, they're starting this in kindergarten. It's produced by the ACLU, the Human Rights Campaign, Gender Spectrum, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and the National Education Association. The NEA is the largest teachers union in the United States. And it partnered with 4 left-wing activist groups to create the handbook to advise teachers and principals and superintendents on how to support transgender students in K through 12 schools. And the bottom line, ultimately the school environment has to be set up so transgender girls are treated like all other girls and transgender boys like all other boys. Now they're very concerned about privacy, not the privacy of the girls who might have to share a bathroom with the boy who identifies as a girl, but the privacy of the student identifying as transgender to such an extent that they don't want to tell the parents. So another quote, privacy and confidentiality are critically important for transgender students who do not have supportive families. In those situations, even inadvertent disclosures could put the student in a potentially dangerous situation at home. So it's important to have a plan in place to help avoid any mistakes or slip-ups. And they're providing that plan. And so one of the documents that I quote in the book, it's actually a checklist of things that teachers and principals and superintendents can do to ensure that a child could come to school identifying with their biological sex and then transition at school, go to the principal's office and have a new wardrobe there that they can change into, be referred to by a new name and a new pronoun at all of their classes, go back to the principal's office at 4 p.m., change back into their original clothes and be picked up by their mom or dad without the parents ever knowing. It even had a protocol for how to ensure that communications with the student were using the new name and pronoun, but communications with the parents were using the original name and pronoun. So falsifying records, having 2 copies of things like report cards and letters home, one with the new preferred name and pronoun, one with the original, because privacy and confidentiality are critically important for that student, for that minor, not for the legal guardian, not for the parents.